Black dog! It's not like they're in fucking white!
Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
We're going to give you last week's news today. It's
It's a slogan we should put on a t-shirt.
Stop touching her!
I am tonight announcing my candidacy.
Taylor Swift. Look, my biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny.
Having truly rational conversations about controversial issues is risky these days.
Roger,
Andy, how you doing?
pretty good, but I'm pretty sure YouTube thinks I'm a red dang racist.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, I was scrolling through my YouTube feed the other day, and to be fair, half of the videos were within my realm of curiosity, but, you know, I had a mix of videos on offset barbecues. I had another video on, you know, Hitler, if he was speaking in English, what he would sound like. I had a video about the riots, the far-right riots in the UK.
All right, I'm sensing a theme.
I was like, fuck, I hope no one at work ever sees my YouTube feed.
You're definitely voting for Kamala, right?
Well, I saw that she was ahead in the betting odds, so momentum is on Kamala's side.
Yeah, that's because she hasn't opened her mouth yet.
Plenty of time for that.
Sooner or later, she's actually. They have just announced 10th of September for the first debate.
The debate.
That's going to be amazing.
Because he wasn't going to go ahead with it, was he?
Well, I think he wanted to be. Now the power balance was with him, right? And it was. It's kind of reversed from Biden, where he gets to set some of the conditions now. But what's your take on how the press have treated JD Vance since we last spoke?
I think for the first time in his life, he's reached his limit in terms of like potential, right? So, I mean, it doesn't get much more grand than like VP pick for the favorite to win the US election. And I think he's shown himself to be like, okay, like now I'm struggling to get my head above water. Because, I mean, this is a guy who his whole life has always sort of, you know, exceeded expectations, right? And I think, and maybe for the reasons we talked about when we talked about him a couple of weeks ago, I think he has been flailing a little bit because when you play that game of being a chameleon and when you, yeah, like, I mean, I think my view of him was he was genuinely like a really good guy, right? Like, I mean, his book paints a very favorable picture of himself, right? Hillbilly Elegy. But he's had to morph into like this weird monster, like, you know, and I don't think that's actually the authentic him. I think that's just the character he has to play to be the running mate of Donald Trump. And I think this is where he's, the inauthenticity of it maybe. And not only that, but like he's got like a pretty long list of quotes that maybe are coming back to haunt. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yes, it's a really interesting one. I think that some of it, the media is causing that monster to come to life, right? Because a lot, like you said, a lot of the things that he is being held up against are quotes and things way before he was ever in the running to be the VP, right? The pick for the VP. So I'm not sure it's like a chameleon thing rather than the media painting out and going after him very aggressively. And I think there is a bit of a black mirror there with how they have treated Kamala and actually her VP pick.
Just when you say before, you know, these quotes or whatever before he was the VP nominee, right?
Yes.
Do you mean the ones when he was sane and he was like normal and they're coming back to bite because it's like, oh, you know, the worst thing ever to happen would be if Donald Trump was elected or whatever variant of that? Or do you mean the ones that he said when he was like campaigning to be senator and had to go hard right to get support of the Trump acolytes?
Yeah, look, but I mean, there's a bit of both.
Because he's more, he's owned this space of like more right wing than Donald Trump.
Yeah, he has. And you some of your chickens come home to roost, right? But I also think that when it comes to things like abortion and so on, he's often misquoted or misrepresented. Where if you go and listen to his full speech, and I'm not talking about a full Trump-style 1 hour and 50-minute speech. Say they take a segment from his, it's like 3 minutes, and they'll put it into a soundbite and make him sound super crazy, like there should never ever be any abortions, like, and everything like that. And then when you look at the transcript, it makes much more sense and is much more moderated than that. So I think that's what I mean. There are lots of things, and look, fair game, VP pick. You got to do your due diligence, and the media gets a chance to go through all your your hits and your reels. But let's just see if they do the same thing to the Democrat VP now that he's been announced. Let's just see.
My knowledge of JD Vance is still limited to the kind of the pre-going crazy JD Vance, as in up to sort of 2016 or whenever, before his political career, and then his speech at the Republican convention. Like, that's literally all I've seen of him. I haven't seen any speech in the middle. I'm aware of, like, the news reports, maybe in between then, that he'd, like, courted, like, Donald Trump as, like, his sponsor or whatever in his campaign. But, like, other than that, I don't know.
Well, I want to leave it here just for one thing, because when we spoke about JD Vance in our last episode, our previous episodes on it, I kind of said that he was a risky pick and he would create a bit of a target on his back. And I feel like that prediction has come home to roost, but you were kind of not on board with that. So what do you think now? Because I feel like it's definitely seen as he wasn't the safe pick, and lo and behold.
I think probably where I was maybe a little bit misguided was that I was probably a little bit more maybe influenced by his underlying core of who he actually is as a person. Because I think actually the real JD Vance is the one that I know. Well, I think I know. Like, I think that's who he actually is. Like, I'm pretty sure that he knows he's playing a character. But I guess maybe where I was maybe a little bit naive is that, like, I think all politicians are characters. They're all playing a character. Yeah. And you could pick any extreme politician, but at the end of the day, they're fulfilling a role. Like, they're playing a role. And I guess in the context of JD Vance, like, yes, he's playing that role too. But it's a mistake to think that because his true underlying character is a little bit more sane, does not mean he'll stop playing the character that he's playing. And I think to your point around him being a risky pick, I think where he's a risky pick is that he doesn't present as a slick kind of man in control. Like, he's a little bit like, he's I don't know, he's kind of like a bro, you know what I mean? Like, he's a little bit flabby, a little bit sweaty, like, he's not a good complement to Donald Trump, who's also those things, right? Yeah. So I think he, in that sense, I mean, this is probably exactly what you said in the podcast when we talked about Donald Trump, is it's not like a pick that rounds out the Trump ticket. You know what I mean?
No. And the other thing is, so one of my main points in that chat was that big target now because of the more extreme things, and Trump's kind of made efforts to back away from the harshness of his abortion stance, and JD Vance drags him back into that right-wing territory again. But the bit that I ultimately think will happen is that Trump will turn on him, like he turns on every strong character, and so I kind of feel like that we will see cracks in that partnership very, very soon.
I don't know though, like, I think like JD Vance, it's a bit like when you're looking at cars, right? You're there to buy a new car, right? And inevitably what happens is, like, the car manufacturer, they design a really shit and poor value variant of the model that's really bad value just to make you think that the second top tier is actually good value. And I kind of feel like that's what JD Vance is doing. Like, he's making Donald Trump look normal and moderate, like in contrast. So the fact that he's more extreme on some of these issues, and instead it's like Donald Trump kind of having to defend his vice president as though Donald Trump is like the sane person to, like, calm the waters and bring everyone down to earth and anchor everything, like, because he's the moderate figure.
It's funny you spin that analogy, because I saw some article, it might have been the Atlantic, when it all came out, where they said JD Vance is the designer handbags of VPs, and I hope Trump kept the receipt. So it was a similar kind of thing where, but look, I reread Hillbilly Elegy after he was announced as VP pick, And I must admit, it is a very distorting feeling reading that book and then seeing how he is portrayed in the media. And it's very, very hard to reconcile, like you said, because the book is so well written, it's so authentic, it's so real, and it's impossible to reconcile to the fact where I don't believe it. Like, I don't believe the portrayal of him in the media. But I can see everyone around me being influenced. You know, they haven't read the book, or they don't care about the book, or whatever it is. And I can see it slipping through his hands, being able to kind of control his image.
But to be fair, like, he has moved like about 10 kilometers to the right since that book. Like, I mean, in that book, he's quite moderate, right?
It stays true
like
to some
his
of that,
view.
It stays true to some of what he talks about in Hillbilly Elegy and the Appalachians and the decaying of, the working class. And,
well, maybe
and
some of the economic policy side, but just some of his far right positions. Like, my sense was that before any of this, if you'd asked me, is JD Vance left wing or right wing, I might say he is intellectually interested in conservative values, like in terms of the role of the family and so on, but in actually a good faith way. Like, he's not culturally of the right. Like, I wouldn't say he's culturally right-wing in the same way as, like, the Christian Bible Belt, really conservative sort of, like the George Bush style sort of Republicans would have been. Like, I would say he actually would have been a bit more, a bit more sort of just a straight shooter,
Southern
right?
Democratic Republicans.
but now he's playing a role, and, like, this is, I think, if he's going to get criticised... I mean, the people aren't criticising him misspeaking in a speech, right? Or some cut-up montage of, like, that sort of misrepresents his views. Like, they're criticising his positions, his actual policy positions on things, right? So I think that's fair game for me.
Yeah, fair enough. Anyway, now tell me about this rabbit hole you've taken me down in the last week.
All right, well, London's burning, isn't it?
Not just London.
Anarchy in the UK, the whole of the UK, and a bit of Ireland too. But so let's just recap the last couple of weeks in the UK. So I think it was a couple of weeks ago, or maybe 2 weekends ago, something like that. 2 weeks ago, there was an attack on I think it was like a dance sort of, or some sort of studio with young girls. 3 were stabbed and killed, and this sort of triggered these massive sort of riots and protests and all sorts of things in the UK. The initial trigger was maybe some misreporting that the murderer, or the stabber who killed these girls, was a Muslim immigrant. And so that kind of led or triggered all these kind of protests about the level of immigration, in particular Muslim immigration into the UK. It turns out, in fact, that actually the perpetrator was not Muslim, was not an immigrant, was born in the UK. But by that stage, it was kind of too late. It had already kicked off. But I guess the reason this sort of triggered a bit of a rabbit warren for me is that I want to kind of understand this, because I was actually watching some videos, like some of those auditors would go and film these protests, and sometimes they're like live streaming. So I'd just be up at night and I'd log on and I'd see like literally live streaming of these riots with police vans being set on fire and hotels being broken into and smashed and all this crazy shit, frankly. And I wanted to understand it a little bit more. So I kind of tracked back a little bit further, and it turns out sort of in late July, there was like this rally by this guy called Tommy Robinson, who is like a far-right sort of figure in the UK. And that was like quite a big rally. I think it was held in London. And that just set this whole, like, that was before the stabbing, and it set this whole mood in the country of just heightened kind of sensitivity, or it was almost like everyone was just, like, it was tinder dry and it was just waiting for the next thing to burst into flames, right? And as soon as then this stabbing thing happened, and then it was like, okay, oh, and by the way, it was a Muslim immigrant, it just all set, a light on flames. But I think what's critical to, realize or keep in mind is that, like, the riots and the protests are not about these murders, right? It's about the core underlying issues that they were out protesting about in that late July rally, right? So anyway, I got into a little bit just to understand it, because it was it does seem a little bit different to just you know, a little bit of like civil unrest. It's because it's the whole country. There's a lot of people involved, and watching some of the videos, like these people who are doing what I think most people would look at the footage of them and go, well, that's like crazy because they're throwing rocks at police and they're doing like senseless violence and vandalism and all this stuff, and very racist, to be frank. But at the same time, these people, like, they feel like they're revolutionaries in Les Miserables. Like, that's how they see themselves. They see themselves as like on the right side of history, like doing good. Like, that's how they see themselves. So I wanted to understand that a bit more.
You know, I'm just taking a step back too. I was reflecting on how the style has changed, right? Like in terms of current events. So usually, you know, if I think about our podcast and maybe a year ago when we used to send each other leads and whatever, you know, things, we want to discuss something that's happening in the world, we'd usually send like an article, you know, or another podcast or something like that, right? Some kind of more journalistic view. But what did you send me this time? It was a YouTube live feed, and with the caption, "This is happening right now. I'm watching this live," right? And I think that that's really interesting to me too, because it's like where your fascination in auditors have now crossed over into, you know, this is probably at the heart of it, what these auditors mean when they claim that they're a citizen journalist or whatever, right? It's actually quite incredible, the fact that it is live, that you're seeing like the unedited version of an event play out. And yeah, it's harder on the other side. It was like harder for me to really understand what was going on, but I was just marveling, maybe this is how it's going to be in the future, you know, like that breaking events actually are recorded in this way rather than traditional news media, you know? So that was really interesting to me. I have since, you know, followed you on this journey to understand more about Tommy Robinson, and he's a fascinating character. He really is, and I know that we probably, given what we've consumed, we're kind of probably, my image of him is a little bit down the road from you.
Can I just say both of our YouTube feeds are now we're now in the doldrums together.
Sky News is loving it. But look, I guess let's talk about his kind of claims, right? Because I think that the bit that here, and we've talked about this on the show before, about there being this alternative truth, right? This alternative narrative around what is happening in society. And it's something that I think Australians probably find a little bit harder to engage with because of the relative stability of our country, relative. And I think this is this idea that has kind of surfaced for me, and it's in that intersection of conspiracy and disinformation with something that's actually true, actually a problem, and potentially covered up, or at the very least distorted by reporting. And that is that the UK have a problem with immigration and extreme Islamic views, right? And when I say they have a problem with it, they have a problem with actual crime, you know, organized gangs and organizations that are committing crimes across the UK, yeah, in a meaningful and statistically significant way. And this is not something, I guess, that I understood properly, right? That I understood anything more than unrest or potentially like social cohesion or conflict as an issue. I did not understand the actual kind of problem of the crime. I don't know, like, were you in the same category?
I certainly don't take my facts and advice from Tommy Robinson, but I think maybe to your point around alternate media sources or whatever, and like the thing, and I think I sort of said this to you earlier in the week when I first kind of watched some of his videos, is that, like, so this podcast is called The Middle, right? When we're trying to explore the middle on things, right? And with someone like Tommy Robinson and the things he's talking about, it's like extreme either way, right? There's no middle ground with Tommy Robinson and his ideas, right? It's either you're like a far right racist who buys into the ideas and you're part of the club and you're quite loud and proud about it, but you probably do have you do have quite extreme views, right? If you're sort of fully buying into that, or you're so opposed to someone like Tommy Robinson, his ideas and everything he stands for and his people and the people who support him, you're so opposed to him that you're blind to any kind of element of truth to any part of what he's got to say. And I think that's what interested me with him. And I don't think we should go down the rabbit hole of like unpacking his documentary and all of this sort of stuff. But essentially there was this court case where he has been bankrupted due to defamation of this kid. And I just was watching some aspects of it. And I wanted to understand more about the actual nature of the case and all this sort of stuff. And like and I might misunderstand it, but my understanding of the nature of this case was that he kind of lost the case off the back of his evidence not being sort of collected in the right way, or it was like he had interviews and
hidden cameras
and just hearsay and just generally like basically there were some claims he made about this kid that he was a bit of a terrorist, or I'm sorry, not terrorist in the literal sense, but in the, he was a bit of a bully or whatever. And he made those claims, and it was off the back of some statements made from, some people in the school that he operated in, or he was attended and so on. But, the judge said, well, look, that's an insufficient basis to be confident you could say that that about him, right? But when you read all the coverage of him and this particular court case, it's all about how, see, he's wrong. He was wrong about it. He shouldn't repeat it. This is horrible that he's done this to this young lad or whatever. Whereas the reality is, it's like, no, there's probably truth to what he's saying about these stories don't get invented. And so I want to understand myself. I was like, well, is he like... And now that's one like microcosm of his whole position, because like that's just probably even like a bit player of like that's like a small part of his whole worldview. But like nonetheless, to me, it was an example of the way that some of the other groups reacted were just so dismissive of like they almost didn't want to acknowledge any part of it that was partially true or had any element of truth to it. That really shat me off, frankly. Like it's like no, I want someone to say, hey, look, this guy's not a good spokesperson, but like there are some legitimate issues that he's talking about.
And that's what I mean, right? Like I think that just because, Tommy Robinson is a working class lad, he presents like a soccer hooligan and, he has a rap sheet like one in a lot of ways, right? I admitted that I didn't understand this particular aspect to some of the crime, right? And I did a bit of research on the back of it, right, to try to fact check some of it. I'm going to talk about three things, right? And just after I read them all, you can give me your views on whether it reframes the problem for you. So about three key incidents around different scandals. The first one, and these are kind of documented in actual reports, and I'll kind of name some of those sources in a second. Rotherham scandal, 1997 to 2013, an estimated 1,400 children were sexually exploited over a 16-year period, and the majority of the perpetrators were Pakistani Islamic people, men, and the victims were predominantly white British girls. Independent inquiry led by Professor Alex Jay highlighted gross failures of police, social services, local authorities to address the issues of abuse, for a variety of reasons, but mainly a fear of being labelled a racist. Rochdale, 2008 to 2012, 9 men were convicted for sexually exploiting girls as young as 13. They were, again, Pakistani Afghan descent, and it received widespread media coverage, again, highlighting systemic failures in how authorities responded to the victims' allegations. Finally, Telford, going back all the way to the 1980s to the 2010s, investigation suggested up to 1,000 girls have been sexually exploited in Telford over the several decades. Perpetrators, again, South Asian, Pakistani, Afghani kind of descent, and issues around how the authorities handled the complaints. So those, like I said, and some of those statistics have been kind of come from child exploitation and online protection centers and other groups like that, right? So again, this is a clear example of like what you said, where you can write off everything Tommy Robinson represents and says, but there are real crimes. And like these are happening in small towns and things, right? Where you imagine 1,400 girls, white girls, being molested and raped by a specific ethnic group. Wow. Like, talk about like an impact to a town's kind of cohesion and sense of what that particular group represents, right? So you can kind of like, again, it's like understanding some of these things. Like hearing all those things, what would you say to that?
Well, one must do some significant throat clearing before we talk about topics like these. So, look, obviously there's, to even ask the questions, some of these questions in that way, there's a certain kind of objective you're trying to get to, right? Which is that, like, there's something fundamentally wrong with, like, Muslim communities in terms of their attitudes towards either combination of women or, Western values or whatever, right? But, I mean, this is the thing they talk about, right? This is what a lot of these groups are kind of advocating, or at least trying to draw out, is this notion of, like, two-tiered policing, right? Which is that you have an approach for everyone else, and then you have this delicate approach to Muslim communities or Muslim perpetrators, that you stay away from them. You don't proceed to take action because you're fearful that you'll be branded like a racist. So if you pitch to me that a culture that is influenced by a religion that has not been through a process of moderating, with Enlightenment values, for example, that is still very much foundationally the same as it was centuries ago, versus Western liberal values, that is the predominant culture in the UK, there's no way I would say, yes, that's a good thing, right? So for me, definitely, in terms of like where these cultural factors are kind of concentrated, like, that is not a good thing. However, where I don't quite buy it is I think it's oversold. Like, the problem is over-egged. Like, really, like, because I have no doubt that there's certain communities where these like impacts are kind of concentrated. And like, you've rattled off some like absolute numbers which sound horrific, but at the same time, like, this stuff happens in regular communities too, right? The reason people are out like smashing windows in hotels and trying to burn them down and all that kind of stuff, it's not born out of like a genuine, we need to fight heart disease or something like that, right? There's a problem and the government hasn't recognized that heart disease is a problem. So we need more investment in heart disease. We need to, reduce saturated fat, right? They're saying, hey, I don't like that my community looks fundamentally different to the one that I grew up in.
We'll jump there, but I think I need to hold you to some parts of this, right? And myself, right, for our discussion, rather, hold our discussion to this. So there's an inclination for you to step back and go, number one, this must be wrong, or number two, this mustn't be significant. And if you added up all the sexual exploitation over that period, you'd find that it was still majority proportional, or it wasn't statistically important that the perpetrators were in these Islamic groups or whatever it is, right? And I think that's what I'm talking about, right? There's this, as Australians, that's where the mind goes. Like, this is just a weird accounting error. It's not statistically significant that this is happening and that there's a racial element to it, right?
I don't think it's even that, though. Can I just give, like, what it is for me? It's that if you've got certain groups or certain people like Tommy Robinson, for example, giving statistics, they might very well be real, but like, and they might be from credible sources, but they're clearly, there's an agenda behind them. And like, you give me any agenda that you want to push, there's always like a coterie of statistics you can claim, right? There's always like, and it's, unless you're in good faith trying to ask the question in a neutral way, and you're going at it from, a place of good faith, and you're genuinely trying to answer this question without trying to like come to the conclusion that Muslims are bad, right? Because that's what this guy's doing. He is trying to do that.
Yeah, but keep him out of it for now. Like, I'm trying to walk us through this.
Yeah, but you're referring stats that he's referenced.
No. He hasn't referenced these stats. He's talked about the problems around grooming gangs and Islamic rape gangs in these UK precincts.
Well, I mean, in rugby league here in the NRL, we have
but they're not.
We have similar issues, right?
Mate,
you know what I mean?
Mate, these rugby league teams are not raping 1,400 women of a certain ethnic.
Well, maybe if you take every rugby league team in the country,
buddy.
they
All
might.
right. Let's stay focused, Andy. This goes to the whole over-egging thing, right? Like, step at a time. Do we believe that this is statistically significant for it enough to
I don't
affect
know,
a
and
community?
I don't think either of us could know. Like, I think if you take 100 people of a certain culture and compare them to another culture, you will find differences in like things that are happening, and it doesn't surprise me that as I alluded to before, that a community that is culturally influenced by a religion that hasn't changed for hundreds of years, and like, I'm an atheist, so I'm very tolerant and open to people who are religious and respect that. But if that's guiding your day-to-day life, where it's inconsistent with our modern liberal Western tolerant values that we have, I have no time for it. And frankly, a lot of the stuff that we see, like in extreme scenarios, that reflects like ancient values, right? That aren't fit for modern times, right? So that's my view, right? But at the same time, I think what we're often reacting to is like the extremes. We're not talking about like the main.
I think in these communities, this is an extreme impact, right? When you have this targeting coming from one group, and look, even if it's just easy to have the conversation to take out change up all the races, right? Because it's a similar thing in a lot of ways to this whole, like, there's echoes here around Black Lives Matter, right? With the riots and the things like that, right? You could turn that, you could take the wind out of it by changing the races and whatever. But let me tell you, if there was a community, you know, like these, and there was a problem with a particular group, ethnic group, committing crime in a certain way over a prolonged period, and there were reports into systemic failures of the government, of policing, of social services, of the courts to deal with it, then you're going to have a certain reaction coming from people that are at their wits' end, right?
Yeah. Can I just make one point, right? To begin with, there's about 5% of the cohort, young people throwing bricks, committing violence. They're doing that because it's just a bit of fun, right? Then you have the other 95% who are there for like a whole coterie of reasons, right? And so when you're saying like define the problem, like they're not all protesting about Muslim rape gangs, right? That's like a thread of the story. But what they're protesting about is a whole mix of things. It's about their communities changing. It's about lack of job opportunities and their perception that whatever opportunities do exist are going to people from other countries who've immigrated. It's about like a loss of identity. It's about status. Like, I think status is huge because like these are people who don't have much status. Like the people out protesting, you know, they don't have successful careers. Like they're not respected in their community, right? And then they're quite disillusioned, right? So there's all these different things going on in the background. They are not out there protesting about Muslim rape gangs, right? That's not what's motivating them. It's part of like the rhetoric of Tommy Robinson, but that's not what like most of these people are out there actually responding to. So then to the actual claims, like, you know, is this a problem? Well, look, fuck, any form of violence against women is a problem. Like, I think we can certainly say that. Is it statistically a problem, like in some kind of significant way? Well, I can't say that because I've not looked at the data. Right? Like, you've given me some figures, but like, I don't know. Is that like, maybe that's proportionate? I don't know. Maybe it's disproportionate I don't know. I don't have the context, right? If you told me it's 5 times higher than for the rest of the UK population, my answer would be, well, yeah, it probably reflects like some underlying cultural issues in that community. That yes, it is a problem. So yes, I can admit that. There's no problem in sort of coming to that conclusion.
I think there is, though.
I think there's a lot of people who don't even want to have that conversation and don't want to talk about it. But back to my earlier point, I don't think this is the reason why people are protesting. Like, I think it's like a talking point in their repertoire, but it's not. It's driven by other factors. Like, it's not like this is the whole thing. They perceive themselves to be, you know, like the revolutionaries from Les Mis, because they see themselves as protecting their daughters, right, and their sisters and all that sort of stuff. But don't
you think that some of it's a symptom, right? Like, say if you have a gang problem in a community, right? What always happens is a roadhouse scenario where you got to hire the bikies to run protection for you, and all of a sudden you need kind of like thugs to fight thugs. Like, isn't that like a tale as old as time?
I don't know. I think in finding the middle here in this space, my instincts are not to like jump on some, line of inquiry about, like how fundamentally flawed Islam is you
don't have to go straight there though.
But that's where you're going, right?
No, I'm not.
Well, for me, the first thing is to think, well, what's driving the actual riots and protests, right? Like that for me is the starting point.
But you just started this saying that you don't, because of the style and how they're portrayed as far right, you don't take any of their claims seriously.
For me, it's more saying, well, look, you can't be an elite from London who in, a very privileged position, whether because of your upbringing or you're a professional or whatever, and look down on these people from Northern England who are quite, economically isolated, that have borne the brunt of like immigration. Like if you live in, an upmarket part of London, for example, you don't see immigrants because they're not there. You know what I mean? They don't live in your community. It's less likely that your community has any visible negative downsides of immigration. Whereas if you live in a poor community, you see it every day. You see it in your town centre, you see crime, you see, like, there's all sorts of other issues, and it's very visible to you. And if you've seen the evolution of your community evolve, it's not that you're reacting to violence, it's that you're reacting to the essence and the flavour and what you believe your home should be and what it was eroding away before your very eyes. And that's what they're seeing. Whereas, let's say the people who would condemn them as far right without even empathizing with them for a minute need to understand that. So that's where I would come from. I wouldn't be like, let's jump straight to... I think that's not the right first step. I think it's like kind of taking or biting at the bait that those kind of groups are setting for people. Like, it's like, hey, here's this thing that you've got to like latch onto, and you've got to come along this journey and like come out educated about how there are these really deep-rooted like issues with Muslim immigration or whatever, or even immigration more generally.
But you just laughed at that fact, right?
What do you mean?
You said that there's some deep issues with Islamic immigration to the UK, and you like laughed. Like, you're not. That's what I mean about people not taking any of their points with any inquiry, right?
Yeah.
The reason I took one of their claims, I looked at some reports and just put the facts there. I'm not saying drawing a bow to that Islamic people or inherently violent or dangerous or whatever it is, but it's a place that you either have to go, okay, I'm writing this off, or I am believing some statistics, so I'm not drawing that same conclusion, or you start to form opinion about it. Like, it is possible, it is again statistically true that immigration levels in the UK have ramped up and exploded, and the Muslim population as a percentage have grown incredibly, and they've taken a lot of refugees and this kind of stuff. That causes certain economic, certain societal conditions where gangs can flourish and things like that. And then at the same time, small town policing or whatever may not be equipped to deal with fast changing dynamics, right? That's a more reasonable line of inquiry that you could follow without any of the charged elements that go along with this far right labeling.
When groups shut down these groups as far right and use that as, let's say, a piece of rhetoric to kind of shut down these kinds of conversations, it's in reaction to these groups genuinely being far right and genuinely having extreme perspectives. But I think what I'm kind of getting at is that I think some of this stuff that gets discussed, it's an ex post confabulation of what the rationale for having these views are. So there's the real reason they've got these views, which probably do have more deep-rooted nationalistic, racist, kind of tribal elements to them. It's things like these are people who form their views about these topics in their early teens. Like, these are people who, as 13, 14-year-olds, learn either by socialization or even just their own sense of identity that they don't like seeing that, like, you know, they like to go to the football where they have fun with their English sort of white mates, right? And they don't like then going out of the football ground and seeing all these immigrants everywhere who completely different to them and foreign to them. They like the England of old, right?
I don't think that's true.
I think that's 100% true. And then you have someone like Tommy Robinson, who's slightly more eloquent than them,
Slightly.
then coming in and putting together some sort of a coherent story behind it. And I'm not saying that story's wrong or completely wrong. In fact,
Well, you kind of am.
this episode is about finding that middle, right? In my mind, right?
Okay, let me give
and,
you
and
him a
I
middle
agree,
thing.
and I think there's part of that story which is kind of true, but that's not actually what's driving and motivating.
Yeah, and I agree with
the
that
writers,
part. I
right?
agree with that part. The motivations of the collective, which is hard to kind of make a collective statement on a mob. But let me ask you this, right? So I listened to, again, a YouTube live feed of Tommy Robinson giving a speech, and it's now obviously gone viral and all this kind of stuff. Now, in this speech, talking to a pretty hard-nosed left-wing reporter, really pushing him on the issues, he claims that he has no problem with the migration of immigrants. And in fact, he comes from a very diverse background, Sikhs, Hindus, things like that, even Polish, have integrated well into the community. It is actually the Islamic extremists that are the problem. Do you believe him when he says that, or do you think it's cover? Because if we,
I think that's exactly what you would have to say in that interview, whether you believed it or not.
well, he's saying some other pretty crazy stuff. I'm just asking you, like, do you think that is cover, or do you think, because if he's portrayed in some of the ways that you're saying, he's just a white nationalist and
Right.
he doesn't want Sikhs at the football match, right? But he's saying, I have no problem with them. They've integrated lovely. You know, they're great people. My friends are Sikh and Hindu. But the problem is these Islamic kind of gangs.
Okay, well, I'm going to grant you a couple of things, right? I'm going to grant you everything you've just said, take it at face value. Yes, there's a problem with Muslim immigration. There's
Just
all
for the
of those
purposes of
things.
this conversation, Andy, these aren't my views.
I know. Okay,
don't,
well, I'm going
don't
I'm
pay
gonna,
me off for
okay,
some
okay,
kind
sorry,
of,
I'll rephrase that.
you know?
I'm going to grant Tommy Robinson everything, right?
Thank you.
But, and this is the big but, right? His approach to addressing these issues is totally fucked, right? This is like the absolute, like, this just stokes community tensions, right? We've talked before about the power of de-escalation, right? The power of taking the heat out of things, right? And the way to kind of address some of the issues that he's talking about is collaboration with those communities. It's done kind of a little bit out of the public eye. It's not, you don't go and stoke tensions. You don't, let's say, post that, you know, the kid who stabbed the girls was probably a Muslim immigrant. So, you know, hey, 30,000 followers, you know, or however many followers he's got, take a load of that. What do you think you should do now? Like, kind of thing. Like, this is not what you do if you're a responsible kind of public figure. And so when people go and shut him down, the reason they're not engaging with anything he's talking about is because he's a revolutionary. He is someone who wants revolution. I don't know what revolution looks like in what his goals are. But I think I said to you kind of maybe earlier today, I will certainly not charge him with like aspirations of genocide, to be clear.
Yeah.
But like, he is literally like following the same trajectory as Adolf Hitler. And he's probably currently at his like Munich beer hall putsch sort of phase, right? Like he's
Getting
riling up
the
a crowd.
rhetoric, workers' union.
He's absolutely like engaging people in a way, in exactly the same way as Hitler did. Now, I'm not trying to kind of say that he's the next Hitler or anything crazy like that, but like this is a little bit scary for some people. So I don't know, like I'm not going to listen to what he says about this stuff and take him at face value. And of course he like lays claim to being like a journalist or documentary maker. No, fuck that. He's an activist, right? He is not a journalist. You know what I mean? Like, and for him to kind of,
He's a journalist in the same way Exhibit is a mechanic.
he is putting, not to be disparaging, but like he's kind of putting enough out there to make him look credible to those with an IQ under maybe, let's say, 1 or 2 standard deviations below the mean, to make it like passable for those people who can't kind of read the signals and the red flags. Like, because the thing is, like, I want to watch him, and I do watch him because I want to understand him. And I'll tell you, like, right now, I'm not like going to say, oh, he's 100% all wrong. Right? I'm going to say there's absolutely some stuff in there that's like I'm interested in, like, and I want to kind of grant him as much as I can, right? But then equally, like, his motivations and what he's actually setting out to achieve and his objectives and his methods, like, I'm deeply, like, skeptical and cynical of that.
And I am with you at that platform, right? There's a very distinct feeling that you get when you listen to an infomercial where you start to, that you're only hearing one side of the story, but you can almost feel yourself being influenced in a way regardless. And I think that these people like Tommy Robinson have that effect on people. But we started off talking how he's very quick to label someone and then their actual concerns get lost. And they can come from a crude frustration of what's happening on the ground, potentially.
Is that why you have so many kitchen gadgets?
That is true though, right? Like, you can sit someone down and play an infomercial. You know it's fake. You know that it's only one side of the story, but you're still influenced, right? That's just part of the way the human brain works. But there are some stuff behind this, right? I think it's a real disservice to just brand everything as far right, number one. I want to talk a bit more about the riots themselves, because this is also part of it, right? Like, I think, what are your thoughts on this slogan around two-tier policing?
Well, I think I've heard more credible figures in the UK say, like, this is actually a thing, right? So there's the Tommy Robinson sort of view of two-tier policing, but he's not the only one saying it. So I think we should...
Well, let's define it. On its base level, right? It's the fact that the police have one rule for dealing with certain minority and ethnic groups, say more lenient towards them, and more harsh for white, privileged British nationals.
Well, I don't live in the UK, right? I'm not close enough to the UK or in any of their experiences to have any informed view on this whatsoever. So I'm not gonna sort of express whether I think it's there or not, because what the fuck do I know? But what I'll say is that I can imagine how that would be part of a sensible policing strategy, which is that if you're trying to achieve good outcomes as like a police force, you have to work with your community, and you might prefer to deal with some of the issues that you're observing in one community differently than you might another. So you might appreciate that the rest of the community have no reason to, react a certain way in certain circumstances. So we're going to come down like the full force of the law and, do whatever it is that we would do for the mainstream. But then on occasions you might look at a certain community, and we're talking here about the, Muslim community, and you might say, well, actually some of these issues are a little bit more complicated. And to be frank, we see similar situations here in Australia when it comes to Indigenous communities.
Oh, yeah.
You do not see the police taking the same approach to Indigenous crime. And I think that's because you have to build trust with a community. And if you're just seen as like the bad guys all the time, you have no hope of building that trust. So I think they have to play this delicate balancing act.
It's interesting. I like that theory. I just don't think it's true, because for that to happen, there'd have to be some centralized strategy that's taught out to each of the beat cops on how to respond to these things. And I don't think there is. I think it's like a very organic thing.
I don't think they charge... Well, I don't know 100% what the charge is, but I don't think the charge is that individual police officers don't enforce the law when it comes to when they see a Muslim breaking the law. I don't think that's what they're saying. I think what they're reacting to is that it would be utterly intolerable for... Let's say there was, like we mentioned, like the NRL, right? If, let's say, a football team in the UK, there was an example of, or an allegation made that there was like a gang rape or something, right, by a football team, right? It would be... Yeah,
you take that call pretty seriously, don't you?
Like, it would be incomprehensible that would not be like fully investigated, dealt with very aggressively and resolved as swiftly as possible. Whereas I think the allegation is that if there was some allegation of this occurring, and maybe there's more grey areas as well, like, because they're not coming to police saying I was raped. Like, these girls are like, have been culturally embedded into a community, and they might have some different view later, but like these are not black and white sort of. Like it's there's a lot more complexity to some of these issues. So then the rest of the community says, "Oh, they're taking our daughters or whatever." But then the cops go and speak to the daughters, and they say, "No, I'm happy. I'm here voluntarily, right?" And maybe there's other stuff going on and stuff.
Maybe
like it's
let's
very
not
complicated.
but let's not paint that into that territory that they're complicit in some of these things. What about parallels between the way, say, like the Black Lives Matter riots were handled versus the riots we're seeing ongoing now in the UK? How would you draw, like, to you, is that just like a spurious kind of apples and oranges?
No, I think that's just like the psychology of mobs, and you know what I mean? Like it's the way you see, like the beauty of watching live streamed footage of these riots is that you literally see and hear what people are saying in real time, bit by bit, right? And you can hear, like when you see the news recaps of these things, they always go to like the most dramatic footage, and it'll be like something catching on fire or some, you know, epic piece of violence or a fight or something like that, right?
Yeah.
They'll never show like the little granular conversations. So you pick up and you hear all of these conversations that are happening in the crowd, and you get a sense of their psychology. You get a sense of like what they're thinking and where they're coming from. And just like quietly, like some of these people are fucking stupid as fuck, right? Like they are not very bright. Like they are low socioeconomic, low education.
Oh, careful, Andy.
They might, and like that's not necessarily their fault. Like there can be like lots of generational disadvantage and all this stuff
Judgment with a
going
side of pity.
No, but like it, but like what I'm trying to get at here is these are not people with like really, and this is the problem with like in my mind of like over egging too much about like, you know, what's the real reason they're out protesting? Like, oh, because of all this, you know, very specific nuanced things to do with like Islamic immigration. Like that's not really what I hear. That's not what I pick up. I pick up like they're almost like they're spectating. Like they're actually spectators first. Like they're probably, most of them are there not because they believe in anything at all, but because they want to see that building being burnt down. They want to witness it. They want.
Well, let me pile on.
Literally, I'm spectating the same thing they're spectating. Only they're doing it.
Yeah, but the difference is you're not shirtless throwing a chair into the
but
mob.
neither are most of these. Most of these aren't either. They're just standing back. Like actually, it's only like 5% that are doing all that shit.
When I tuned into the live stream, I'll just pile on while we're in the judgment gutter, and there was this Barmy Army looking guy, like stereotypical Barmy Army looking pom, and he had his shirt off. He had the biggest gut. It was pale. It was like blindingly pale. And he was just like going for it, like throwing things. And I just thought to myself, this is the most amount of exercise this guy has gotten like fucking all year. This is really healthy for him, because he was just like so fat, and his belly. And it's just like, it must get to a certain stage where you've got such a big beer belly that it actually feels good to just take the shirt off. And it's like, it's not even like I'm fat anymore. It's just like a party trick. It's just like, let it roll.
I just love the one where the cops get the dogs out, like they've got police dogs and stuff. And then this like woman with like, you know, like missing teeth or whatever. Says, oh yeah, you got black dogs too. Can't even find a white dog. Just
black dog. this black dog's got like an iced out chain on his collar and everything. But hey, look, like I think that we can both admit, though, find some common ground, that the danger here is that all of the riots, like get distracted by the carnival show of seeing a certain type of person that makes the news highlight that's just utterly ridiculous and thuggish and, you know, whatever. Like I think that you need to treat some elements, try to get to the viable root cause for some of the stuff, right? And like work on that behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think it would be a bit of a mistake if the political establishment just looked at this and just said, oh, this is just, you know, a little bit of...
public schools, what are you going to do?
Yeah, a bit of like right-wing, you know, you're never going to get rid. Like, I think they've got to look at the fundamentals here, but I don't know that what they're calling for is necessarily the solution. You know, we in Australia, we've got policies around border controls, right? We absolutely have that. Like we do take a lot of refugees in, but we take them in on our terms and we manage it a lot better. Whereas I think in Europe, well, there's a lot of kind of philosophical objections to doing things like, I mean, well, for one, we're an island, so we tend to have different kind of like the notion of boats and turnbacks and all that, like, whereas they've got a lot of people arriving on trucks and, in the back of lorries and stuff like that. So it's a little bit different, and people coming by plane even and so on. But yeah, like they've got a lot of refugees, and some of them are economic, some of them are real refugees, and they've got to sort that out. And anyway, there's a lot of different stuff going on. We manage ours a lot better in that we can kind of, take the amount that we want to take, even though we're still quite generous. But then, like, once we take them in, we can sort of make sure we've got, good communities for them to go into, opportunities and help them, right? And if just quietly as well, we can do a little bit of cultivation of the intake. So we can sort of say, hey, what we actually want to do is take families. We want a good balance of men, women, children. We don't want all of these young men of military age escaping wars, right? Which is what's there. A lot of them are reacting to in the UK. I'm not actually making this charge myself, but this is how they're perceived. They're perceived as gutless men who are escaping at the expense of women and children. Like that's how they're perceived. So, and they're economic migrants as well. They're not genuine refugees. So that's the perception. We manage it here. So when you look at the policy from a policy perspective, I think these are the kinds of conversations that, maybe should be had, right? Like, how do you actually manage it? But again, back to like some of my earlier like comments, like I don't think you solve these sentiments by like just solving some short-term refugee problem, right? Like I think there's fundamental challenges with certain communities, certain locations in the UK, where the impacts of some of this stuff's being concentrated, where economic opportunity is quite, quite low, and yeah, but like, can I just say, like, we haven't talked, maybe to throw a question back to you, like, we haven't talked much about, like, the counter-protests, right? So I think we should, also mention there's been, like, significant amount of... Like,
I think by the time I got to YouTube, your algorithm had already been changed to a red pill, so I didn't get to see the counter so much.
Well...
Maybe enlighten me.
Well, but basically the counter-protests, like, there's been, like, a mobilization of, people who want to stand up and say, hey, no, like, this is not who we are. Like, we're not racist. We're not, like, intolerant. We're not, we welcome people. Like, we want to help. Like, it's not within our spirit to be like this. However, I've probably presented that, like, the counter-protests in maybe, like, how I imagine, like, a little old lady in, like, sipping tea in, like, a...
It's like a Catholic youth group or something that you're describing.
Yeah, like that. But like, I should say, like, most of these counter protests, like, are all organized by like the usual clique of like LGBTIQ, socialist, union. Like, they're all the classic left wing sort of groups that you would normally expect, and they're the worst. They are the absolute worst because they have no idea. Like, they've got no ability to empathize with the other side. They've got no ability, and they do not want to concede. And this is back to what originally like got me going on this topic. They've got no ability to concede any of the issues. Like, so it's just literally, no, this is all wrong. Like, they're all wrong. Like, even to the point where if you ask them, do you believe we should have, like, control our border? Like, that we should even have a border. They're so afraid to concede that, yes, we should control our border, that they won't even entertain that kind of a conversation. Like, and I've seen videos, in fact, I sent you one before, of Mr. Piano Man trying to interview people on the streets, and there's a video of him with this, he calls him a soylent woke dude, but anyway. Soy boy, yeah. And he's trying to pin him down on like, so do you think we should have borders? And Soy boy's like, oh, quick, get the police. He's a right wing extremist. It's like, fucking hell. He's just now. I mean, he's doing a little bit of trolling, of course. Like, fair enough, but like, it's like these people have no ability to empathize with the other side. So. That's not a question. I appreciate it, but I don't know. What are your
Shall
thoughts?
I take that as a comment?
Yeah. Thanks, Tony Jones.
I just kind of think that it's almost too late once it gets obviously to the riot. Yeah. And I think that we had this kind of exchange when this was all starting, and it's this idea of you can be too secular about some of this stuff, right? And I think it was maybe in regards to, say, someone like a Sam Harris, who talks a little bit about this kind of divide and trying to rationalize some of this the situation. And it's all on the premise that people can be rational or can actually like take their point of view, process someone else's lived experience and their position, and meet somewhere in the middle. And when you experience things like this, like riots and, you know, civil unrest and whatever it may be, it makes you start to feel like the odds are going the other way. You know, like it makes you start to lose a little bit of hope in our ability to, you know, reconcile as a society, right? I also think back to a comment we were talking about with the Olympics, where there was some replay of Kathy Freeman in the Sydney 2000 Olympics, and you said to me, it was just a better time back then. We had like this better view societally of like reconciliation. We weren't as captured by this whole the right and the left and all that kind of stuff. Like, I feel like growing up, we never had that.
To the Kathy Freeman example, like I watched that on the train home actually. Like, this is her winning gold medal in Sydney. But I gotta say, like I got a little bit emotional. And I've never felt emotional watching that before. Like, I never really felt it hit or land in any kind of way, but it did when I watched it. But then, like the way that everyone was talking about it, it was talked about as this massive moment for Indigenous Australia. And I think the difference between then and now is that like the pace of change was like a level that everyone was comfortable with. Like, well, maybe not at the pace that they would ideally want it, but it was at the pace that the rest of Australia could, that it was true to their own sentiment. Like there was a genuine feeling of like, we want to embrace this moment. We want to acknowledge and give this moment of respect. Whereas then we fast forward, you know, 4 years later, and it's like, no, here's this thing that we're going to thrust upon you, even though you knew nothing about what it was.
Yeah.
Before the last election, and people weren't up for it, and it failed because it wasn't so, you know, with the voice vote. So I think with a lot of this stuff where we're talking about it, like, I mean, it's mainstream UK or mainstream populations in Australia. We're not ready. They're not ready for like the elite progressive view that like,
well, it's like
hey, you've got to forego your chance at getting in the property market so that we can take another 20,000 refugees. Like, they're not ready for that.
It's like a Batman and Joker thing, right? Like, how much does a villain exist because of a hero kind of thing? Like, how much is the far right a reaction to the far left, right? They're kind of just in a centrifuge spinning away from each other for all eternity. You know, I think that there's something to that. Like, there was a really good conversation with Josh Zepps recently, and he described Australia, what he believes Australia, or the core of Australia, the middle of Australia, at heart, are non-woke progressives. And that kind of resonated a little bit with me, right? And like, it goes to your point where we all can actually want to see progress. We just don't want any of the forced sanctimony of wokeness to go with it.
Just a few call-outs to some of the other podcast type things we listened to this week, both of us. I think one of them, there was two. So I think you said to me, "Oh, send me something so I can like catch up on who this Tommy Robinson guy is."
Yeah.
Before this very podcast. And it sounds like you've gone a little bit deeper since, but I sent something with, and I only watched it this week as well, was like an interview with everyone's favourite gender pay gap debunker, Jordan Peterson.
Well, think about Postman.
So I thought, okay, well, we need some sort of credible entry in point to Tommy Robinson, and I think even though Jordan Peterson's now on the fringe of acceptable public discourse now, nonetheless, he is probably about as mainstream and accepted as I think Tommy Robinson's going to get. So watch that. And by the way, it was a very light touch interview. It was very he a softball interview sort of thing. But
the best bit, just to hold you right there, was at the end, towards the end of the podcast, Tommy Robinson, he was in Canada for an event, and he was like, "Oh, we'll be at this rally. I'd love for you to be there. Would you be there?" He was like, Peterson was just like, "Oh fuck," silently, and had this awkward pause and didn't really respond to it, and it was just like that was just amazing. It was just like, fuck.
Because he knows it's like a bit tough.
He can't go right, so he just had this awkward kind of pause, like a microsecond too long.
But to Jordan Peterson's credit, and I was watching this almost in awe of Jordan Peterson, like to kind of acknowledge him, and he's actually often got some really genuine, really good insights, right? And he made this comment about because this was 3 weeks ago, so this is before this interview occurred before all of these riots, but around the time or just before Tommy Robinson was going to have his massive rally in London. And Jordan Peterson made this comment around, you have to harness a positive message. You have to make sure that this doesn't spurn into negativity. You've got to make sure it's a positive vision, and you're a working class leader and I admire that from you, but you got to make sure your movement has a positive vision for the future and doesn't just get sidetracked and taken over by these negative, hostile actors. And fucking hell, I tell you what, Jordan Peterson on the money there. So, because that's exactly what happened. And that's the first one. And the second podcast-ish thing that what I mentioned that I think we both listened to in recent weeks was Sam Harris on the Econ Talk podcast with Russ Roberts, giving his fairly brutal assessment of Islam, right? And why we should care and why it's a problem. And I listened to that around the same time as all of this, and I just remember thinking even if I can intellectually kind of understand Sam Harris's argument, I can't get what he's saying. Maybe there's a cohort of the population who can listen to that and understand genuinely what he's actually saying, and then there's everyone else who just say, "Oh, so you're racist then?" That's kind of the response to it. But I don't know. I can get what he's saying, but same time when I see what's happened in these recent weeks or in the UK, I think, well, the rest of the population aren't ready for this kind of message. They take that message and this is what they go and do. They go and riot on the fucking streets. And I just think, for me, there's a little bit of a, gap between, the intellectual argument against, why we should be concerned about Islam and it being, the muddle load of bad ideas, as Sam Harris puts it. And, this whole thing of, the solution is not stoking tensions in the community. And it's the same with Tommy Robinson. Even where you can find grains or elements of truth and you might sympathize with it or get some, yeah, that's right. He's right. He's talking sense. Even so, got to be really careful not to do the wrong thing in response to having come to terms with that.
I agree. They were both good podcasts. I actually liked the Jordan Peterson interview. He's my kind of self-righteous, pious kind of man. And yeah, he's definitely on the money with a lot of things. Obviously someone who still has a lot of trauma and scar tissue from the way that he's been treated, I suppose, or he's been his cancelling, I suppose. He's still recovering from that.
Hey, Elon's let him back on X.
I didn't love how his wife was there, and her one contribution was, "I trust Trump."
Yeah,
I'm like, is that really all you're going to say?
Come across quite the intellectual match for Jordan Peterson.
But hey, bring your wife to work day.
Well, apparently, it's pretty telling that she was the one that connected him with Tommy Robinson.
Anyway, but you're right about the Sam Harris bit. I think that I fear that people just take what they want, right? I do. I mean, it's funny because, our show's called The Middle, and that's where I go back to, I do want to believe that a lot of people, the middle is progressive. The middle is practical, and is curious, but maybe it's just what you see, right? So there's also this other thing in the back of my mind where, because of social media, because of this individualistic, centrist kind of culture that we live in, that it pays dividends to have a very loud and controversial position on everything, very Gen Z, it's permeated, like why I'm never eating Doritos again. Catchline, whatever. Like, I think that people have extreme views and they're more confident to shout them from the rooftops at the moment. But there is a noted effect that when you get someone, that same person who has the view, and you corner them in a one-on-one conversation, perhaps even push them on their position, inevitably it moderates down to something in the middle, right? And I reckon a lot of that would play out in society. Like, I think I guess what I'm saying is how much of this is just an aberration or a distortion from the way that we communicate now, right? Through social media and through the social credits on having a view on something, right? Having a cause to your name or whatever, right? Like, whether it be like Palestine, Israel, and, trans rights and all this kind of stuff. Like, I think some of it's that, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I think so. But can I just say, like, is there anything more unholy than the alliance between the LGBTIQ community and, like, Islamic fundamentalism? Like,
queers for Palestine, or
yeah, like, I mean, this idea that you've got a group who, for the last 50 years, has been railing against mainstream culture that's been, like, against LGBTIQ rights and intolerant in, like, let's say, Western societies. And then what they do is they turn around and say to probably the most repressive values, like, held anywhere in the world today, and go, oh yeah, this group seems like one that we should support. Like, we should get on board with this one. Like, I mean, literally, like, there's YouTube videos of there being, like, a Sharia law brigade that goes around London and tells gay people, hey, faggot, you're not welcome here. This is a Muslim community. And, like, there's literally gangs that go around and do
I thought
that.
we weren't allowed to say the F word.
Oh, that's all right. I was using it in character.
Referential.
But yes, but we're going to go out and protest. Like, that's as an aside. But just my final comment on the whole Muslim Islam thing. One of the reasons I think it's all overblown and overplayed is that we shouldn't really care about the stock of the problem, if that's an analogy that works. Like, so the extent of the problem today is not the thing that we should be paying attention to, whatever the problem is, right? However you want to characterize it, define it, measure it, what we should really be paying attention to is in what direction is it moving? Is this a problem getting worse, or is this a problem improving, right?
Yeah.
That's getting better. And I don't think it's a problem getting worse. I think a lot of...
really?
Well, I tell you why I don't think it's a problem getting worse, because you have a moderation of, like, as groups integrate into, as you have, first, second, third generation Muslims sort of integrate into society, they're going to be more and more influenced by mainstream British culture and values. And I think there's definitely some concentrated pockets where the predominant culture is actually not a mainstream British Western liberal tradition, Enlightenment values. They're not exposed to those ideas, and that's problematic. But I think, I don't know, I don't pass Muslims in the street here in Australia and think, danger, danger. Like, I'm honestly not thinking, and that's because I think, notwithstanding whatever the doctrine says or whatever the culture says, whatever, la-da-da-da-da, these are not people trying to change Australian values. Like, these are not people who, they might have their own values, they might have their own beliefs and things, but they're not trying to change Australia. Now, I can only comment on Australia. In the UK, is it different? Maybe. But I can't see it being wildly and radically different. And I think over time, like, you will see these sorts of things moderate. And I don't think, I mean, come on, like that.
I disagree for a few reasons. One, because of indoctrination. And, I mean, we've covered that off. I don't want to go through it. I'll just leave it as that. And it takes a long time for this to sweat out generationally when you have indoctrination at play. And two, just the demographic situation. And also, it doesn't help that you've got Elon tweeting the civil war in the UK is inevitable. Death becomes us. But look, I think that at the end of the day, you've got to deal with the root cause.
I don't know. At the end of the day, you know what I'm still like a firm believer of is that like people love economic opportunity. Like they love opportunity. They like, I know that we feel like maybe like the allure of the West has like lost its appeal a little bit, but that's only because like in some other places, like they're getting the dividends of the West. They're getting like the fruit of the West in their like authoritarian dictator-run countries, right? So the appeal of the West is less because they can get some essence of it at home.
You guarantee Kim Jong-un has some American-made goods.
But I tell you what, like honestly, like you go to like these oil-rich Middle Eastern countries and they're like swimming in like Western luxuries. Like they are, the allure of the West is still paramount. And when you say to like a young Pakistani boy in the UK, here's two life like pathways you can take. One is you can become like a devout Muslim and maybe then like a jihadist and a terrorist, or you can.
Sorry, I don't laugh. It's like, that's the one path you've got when you stay in Pakistan.
Well, to be clear, I mean a Pakistani in the UK, right? Living in the UK, like someone of Pakistani heritage living in the UK.
Yeah, no, I got you.
Or you can go to university and become a doctor and have a Mercedes and a house in like a very expensive part of London.
And bend it like Beckham.
Like this is very alluring, and I think, you know, I think for the next generation, like, yeah, there'll be like some people who maybe find that second pathway is not available to them, so they default to the only one that is, which is like a gay man in Italy in the 50s that would join the priesthood because he wasn't going to be respected in his community as a good family man, right? That's what you do, right? When you're excluded from other opportunities. And maybe that's another piece of the puzzle maybe that's the reason why my sense is that like we don't have these issues here because like, well, I don't think we have these issues here because there's also economic opportunity. Like there's like we live and work with our, you know, Muslim, you know, colleagues and friends. And
were you about to say brothers?
Yeah. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like we don't have we don't have that same divide that I think maybe they have in the UK. But I think we're not totally in a different like ballpark. Like I think we're still like there's still the same thing that space for us to kind of have these cohesive communities.
Yeah. Well, all I want to say is that watching some of the way that the UK police deal with the riders, man, they need to you need to give these guys some water cannons or upgrade their gear. This is getting
pepper
ridiculous.
Spray.
Like, man, like,
tasers.
They're getting pummeled out there. They give them something, you know, like get those US style water turrets and freaking beanbag shotguns or something, man. Like they're going out there with like a fucking stack hat and a perspex shield. It's doing nothing.
And they don't even have proper batons anymore. They just have these like little sticks that they're like got a telescope stick device, almost like a car aerial that they then go and like they're whacking them with like a little whip.
50 Shades of Grey kind of. They're just getting awful in the front row. But you know what I mean, right? Like where are the water cannons? Where's like there's going to be serious injury. I mean, there already have been serious injuries. But yeah, like
no, I'm with you. So you mentioned before Black Lives Matters, right? You remember the slogan that came out of Black Lives Matters was defund the police. do you think the that's kind of slogan now, like the same people who were out protesting in the UK for Black Lives Matters probably also chanting defund the police, whether they still think that the police should be defunded now that
I don't know, why don't you ask your girl Kamala?
Yeah, shoes on the other foot. She
supported defund the police.
Who did? Oh, Kamala. Yeah. Well, no.
How's she going to walk back that one?
No, I'm working my way through her biography. She's quite clear that she always supported the police. Yeah, but anyway.
Sorry, I'm doing my part to spread some disinformation on the campaign trail.
Oh, thanks, Roger Trump.
I was wearing our middle hat, by the way, and